The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. I stepped into the glass-walled boardroom, my heels silent against the marble floors, every eye momentarily flicking toward me as I entered. I could feel the chill in the air, not from the AC, but from the stares, the unspoken judgments. I didn't belong here. At least that's what most of them believed. My Uncle Roy was already seated at the head of the table, his gold cufflinks glinting under the recessed lights. He barely looked up before his voice sliced through the silence. "Don't speak unless spoken to," he muttered, loud enough for the whole table to hear. A few of the senior board members chuckled under their breath. Some exchanged smug glances. No one corrected him. No one even blinked. I didn't flinch. Instead, I nodded slowly and took my seat at the far end. Calm, quiet, composed. They thought I was an assistant, or maybe someone's PR girl. They had no idea. While they patted themselves on the back and shuffled presentation papers, I waited, not in silence, but in control. Moments later, the door opened again. This time, everyone stood. In walked him, CEO Franklin Westfield, a man known for toppling and transforming logistics giants with ruthless efficiency. He gave a brisk nod to the table, then his eyes landed on me. "Ah, Ms. Morgan," he said warmly, "glad you could join us." Suddenly, every chair creaked as heads turned. Uncle Roy's eyes narrowed. Before anyone could ask, Westfield gestured to the empty chair beside him, one meant for someone of significance. "This is Kaia Morgan," he announced, calm but clear. "She's our acquisition lead for this transition. She'll be running today's agenda." You could feel the breath leave the room. My uncle didn't move. His eyes darted to the others, as if waiting for someone to laugh or push back. No one did. He tried to smile, but it faltered. I pulled out a sleek black folder from my satchel and slid it across the table. Right to him. "Let's begin," I said evenly. "Page 1 has your new contract terms." He hesitated. Then his hand moved to the folder, fingers slightly trembling as he opened it. "Sign to keep your job," I added quietly. And that was it. The moment the room flipped. From being dismissed with a throwaway line to commanding the entire room's attention, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Because power doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it simply walks in, looks you in the eye, and slides the paper across. They always said I was too quiet to lead. Not in public, of course. In public, they'd say things like, "She's sharp," or "She's got potential." But behind closed doors, when it was just family, their true opinions came out, especially Uncle Roy's. I grew up watching him run Morgan Logistics like it was a royal throne he inherited, instead of a business he was lucky to keep alive. My father, his younger brother, had been the quiet backbone of the operation. The numbers guy, the fixer, the one who actually understood how the system worked. But when he died unexpectedly in a car accident, Roy stepped in and made it clear who was in charge. Now. I was 19, still grieving, still trying to understand what life meant without Dad in it. Uncle Roy barely waited a week before reshuffling the company structure. My father's office? Cleaned out, his staff reassigned, his shares absorbed under some clause Roy insisted was just business. My mother, Ava, was devastated. But she wasn't the kind of woman to fight battles in boardrooms. She baked, she prayed, and she held me when I cried. I wanted to believe there was still a place for me in that company. Not because I needed their approval, but because I had something to offer. I had studied data analytics and operations engineering. I'd built AI models for route efficiency in school that got published in small journals. I wasn't just the girl in the family. I had value. So I started small. Interned over summers, shadowed the logistics team, wrote reports, worked through weekends and holidays without complaint. I redesigned their scheduling software when I was just 21, cutting delivery errors by 18%. No credit, no acknowledgement. The team was told the system update came from Roy's top guy. I remember one particular meeting where I raised my hand to suggest using predictive routing algorithms. Roy looked right at me, smiled like I was a child who said something cute, and then turned to the room. "Anyway," he said, ignoring my idea, "let's move on." I stopped expecting recognition after that. Still, I didn't stop working. I kept my head down and built tools in silence. A dashboard that helped reduce fuel costs. A driver evaluation matrix that cut turnover by 22%. Each time, Roy packaged them up, branded them as his innovation, and got applause for being forward-thinking. It didn't just happen in the office. Even at family dinners, he'd hold court at the head of the table. Talk over me, brag about his genius operations team. My cousins would giggle and say things like, "You should speak up more, Kaia." No one hears you when you whisper. And Roy would lean back in his chair and chuckle. Kaia's like background software, he once joked. Necessary but invisible. That one stung. It wasn't just disrespect. It was dismissal. And coming from a man who took everything from my father and wrapped it in his own name, it was betrayal. My mom always told me, "You don't need to be loud to be powerful." At the time, I didn't believe her. Now I understand exactly what she meant. Because while Roy was busy branding my work as his, I was learning more than he realized. And one day, I was going to do more than just raise my hand. I was going to raise the whole boardroom without needing his permission. I didn't wear flashy suits. I didn't shout over people in meetings. I didn't have a last name that automatically opened doors. Even though I carried the Morgan name in the eyes of my family, especially my uncle, I was never really one of them. In their world, power looked a certain way, loud, aggressive, always male. So when I showed up with charts, strategies, and ideas, they didn't see value. They saw disruption. And worse, they saw someone they could easily push aside. After my father passed, I went from being Victor Morgan's daughter to just Kaia, the quiet girl who lingered at meetings, took notes, and offered ideas. They didn't bother writing down. Every time I walked into the office, it felt like I had to prove I belonged there. Every single day, I'd sit in conference rooms where no one made eye contact with me. I'd raise my hand to speak, only to be interrupted or talked over politely by Roy or Derek. Even when I was introduced to clients or guests, it was always, "This is Kaia, Roy's niece. She helps with some data stuff." Some data stuff. I'd spent months building a forecasting model that helped their trucking division cut costs across the Midwest by 15%. But sure, some data stuff. And then there was Derek, Roy's son. He was everything Roy wanted him to be. Loud, overconfident, always dressed in suits too expensive for someone who didn't know what a spreadsheet was. He had a business degree from a school Roy donated to heavily. That's how things worked in our family. You paid for access, then acted like you earned it. Derek would come into meetings late, take phone calls during presentations, and still walk away with more praise in one day than I had received in 3 years. I remember once catching him reading off a PowerPoint deck I had prepared for a quarterly review. He didn't even change the title. He read my opening line word for word and presented it like it was his own. Roy nodded proudly the whole time. I tried to speak with Roy about it afterward. His response? "Kaia, you're smart, but you need to learn how to play the game. Derek just knows how to present. Maybe you could learn from him." I walked out of that conversation without saying a word. Not because I didn't have one, but because I knew speaking wouldn't change anything. Not in that room, not yet. What made it harder was that my mom, Ava, would still encourage me to show up, to keep building, to keep believing I was meant for more. But every day I returned to that office, I felt like I was shrinking, like I was slowly being erased by people who barely acknowledged I existed. I was always the last one to leave the building, staying late after meetings, making sure the data was right, testing my models again and again. I didn't ask for praise. I didn't ask for promotions. All I wanted was one chance to prove that I wasn't just Victor Morgan's daughter. I was someone with ideas worth hearing. But that chance never came. Because in that world, I wasn't the kind of person they listened to. I wasn't loud, I wasn't flashy, I wasn't male. but I was watching and learning. And the day would come when they'd finally listen, not because they wanted to, but because they'd have no choice. It was a Wednesday afternoon when it happened, just an ordinary day on the calendar, but for me it felt like a shift. The board had just finished a quarterly strategy meeting. Roy had been unusually quiet throughout, letting the department leads drone on while he flipped through financials like they bored him. As everyone packed up, he waved me over casually with 2 fingers. "Kaia, hang back a second." I hesitated. I'd been asked to stay back before, usually to be assigned more grunt work, but something in his tone felt different this time. I took a seat across from him in the now empty room. Roy leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach like a man preparing to deliver something important. "I've been watching your work," he said. I raised my eyebrows slightly, unsure where this was going. The numbers in that fuel optimization report. Sharp thinking. That kind of strategy saves us real money, real value. I blinked, unsure whether I should thank him or wait for the other shoe. He continued, "I've also noticed the vendor compliance tool you built. The dashboard, the alerts, it's tight. That's enterprise-grade stuff." I sat still. Part of me didn't want to let it sink in, but it was happening. He was finally seeing me, not as the niece, not as background software, but as someone capable. "I think it's time you got a bigger role," he said finally. A pause. "How would you feel about being more involved in external ops? Maybe tag along for client reviews, sit in on proposal calls, get some visibility." He smiled like he was offering me a ticket to the big leagues. And in that moment, I actually believed him. I went home that night walking a little taller. My mom noticed it right away. She smiled softly as she stirred a pot of soup on the stove. "You've got that look," she said. What look? The look of someone who's finally being seen. And I believed it. I really did. The next morning, I got in early, dressed sharper than usual, navy blazer, hair tied back tight, polished and ready. I had notes prepared for a client pitch. I even printed a few copies of the models I'd developed. I was ready to tag along, like Roy said. Then I saw the internal memo. Subject, new lead, client development strategy. Name, Derek Morgan. Role, external ops consultant, client liaison. The breath caught in my throat. I stared at it for a full minute, read it again and again. He hadn't given me the role. He'd given it to Derek. The cherry on top? My fuel optimization report and vendor dashboard were attached to the announcement as the foundation for Derek's new initiative. My work. His name. Again. And just like that, the glimmer I had allowed myself to feel, the little flash of being seen, was gone. I walked past Roy's office. He didn't even look up, just muttered something about big things coming as he typed on his keyboard. That day, I sat at my desk longer than usual, staring at my screen, trying not to cry. Not because I was surprised, but because I had let myself believe, just for a second, that maybe I wasn't invisible. But I was. To them, I always had been. And that's when something in me shifted, not with anger, but with clarity. I wasn't going to wait for a seat at their table anymore. I was going to build a different table, one they wouldn't see coming. 3 weeks later, the company hosted its annual fundraising gala, a black tie event meant to impress clients, investors, and local dignitaries. Roy treated it like a coronation. He even hired a PR team to film everything for a corporate brand reel. I almost didn't go. After the Derek announcement, I'd thrown myself into work, eyes down, lips sealed. I wasn't part of their inner circle, and I didn't want to pretend to be. But my mother gently nudged me that morning. "Go," she said. "Show them you're not broken. Show them you're watching." I wore a simple black dress, hair down, no designer labels, no rented diamonds, just me. The ballroom was everything Roy loved. Gold accents, glittering chandeliers, and a long red carpet leading up to a marble staircase. Waiters carried tiny hors d'oeuvres and called everyone sir and ma'am. It wasn't just a gala. It was a performance. As I walked in, Roy was already surrounded by his usual orbit of yes men. He spotted me briefly, offered a polite nod, then turned back to laugh at one of Derek's lame stories. A few minutes later, Roy took the stage. The lights dimmed. The microphone buzzed to life. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice rich with practiced humility. "Tonight isn't just about celebrating our success. It's about honoring innovation, leadership, and the people driving our future." I felt the crowd settle in. "I'm proud to announce a new initiative," Roy continued, "a program designed to revolutionize logistics efficiency in the tri-state area. We're calling it the Horizon Project." My breath caught. The Horizon Project was the name of a model I had written on my own laptop months ago, a comprehensive overhaul of fleet dispatch, built on real-time data, weather integration, and predictive algorithms. I'd worked on it in silence, intending to pitch it once I had it bulletproof. And now Roy was unveiling it like it was his own invention. He clicked to a slide showing graphics I had built. The same sequence, the same title font, even the signature tagline I had drafted. "Efficiency isn't just a goal, it's a system." I stood still, frozen. "And leading this initiative," Roy said, voice rising with pride, "is a young man who represents the next generation of this company. Someone whose passion and vision make him the obvious choice. Derek Morgan." Applause exploded. Derek swaggered onto the stage, straightening his tie like he belonged there. He smiled at the cameras. He didn't even look at me. I watched my family clap for him. I watched investors nod in approval. I watched Roy beam like he'd created a legacy, and I realized in that moment, I wasn't just being ignored anymore. I was being erased. My ideas, my vision, my work, taken, rebranded, and handed over to someone who didn't even understand half of what he was presenting. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a missed credit. It was deliberate. I could feel my mother's hand slip into mine under the table. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. I clenched my jaw and applauded once. Just once. And in that single clap, I made a decision. Let them take the stage tonight. Let them smile for the cameras. Let them steal the spotlight. Because the lights don't stay on forever. And when they go out, I'll still be standing. Only this time, it'll be on my stage. The next morning, the company's social media feeds were flooded with photos from the gala. Derek center stage, arm around Roy. The Horizon Project logo flashing proudly in the background. Captions like, "Next Gen Leadership, Innovation in Motion," filled the comment sections. People congratulated Derek like he'd cured cancer. And me? I wasn't in a single photo, not even the group shot where I had stood at the very end of the row, cropped out, erased. I spent most of that day in my apartment, blinds shut, still in my robe trying to work but unable to focus. My laptop sat open on my desk with the original Horizon files staring back at me. My name was on every file name. My timestamps were embedded in every draft. But no one would ever see that. Not the investors, not the media, not even the internal staff, who'd been told that Derek and Roy worked tirelessly to bring the system to life. Every now and then, I'd get a buzz on my phone, a message from someone who was at the event. "Did you see the announcement? Huge news." "Roy's really putting Derek in the spotlight now, huh? Were you involved in that Horizon thing at all?" I didn't answer any of them. I didn't cry either. I was past that. This wasn't new. This was just the final straw. The betrayal didn't just cut deep because of what they stole. It cut because of how little they thought I mattered. That they could take my work, slap a different name on it, and believe I'd just nod and disappear quietly. That I would accept it. I walked into the office on Monday, and something had changed. Not for them. No. They still passed me by without acknowledgement. Still called on Derek for every forward-thinking comment. Still handed me meeting notes to type up, even though I was a data strategist. But I had changed. I no longer wanted their table. I didn't want scraps. I didn't want thank yous whispered in hallways or nods of approval from Roy like I was a pet who'd learned a trick. I wanted independence. I wanted recognition. And I wanted justice. Not with anger, but with results. I stopped eating lunch in the company cafe. I stopped staying late to fix presentations Derek was supposed to give. I stopped offering ideas in meetings. I became quiet again, but not out of fear or shame. This time, I was quiet like a loaded weapon. At home, I poured myself into building something of my own. I reopened my old algorithms. I mapped out logistics networks from scratch. I researched competitors, mergers, acquisition trends, and weaknesses in mid-level logistics chains. I studied private equity behaviors and how small companies got absorbed by larger ones. But I told no one. Not even my mother. When she asked if I was okay, I'd say, "I'm working on something." And she'd smile softly, trustingly. The silence became my sanctuary. Every time Roy posted another brag or Derek gave another quote to a business blog, it only sharpened my resolve. They were putting on a show, and I was writing their ending behind the curtain. It was lonely. Make no mistake, building alone, dreaming alone, watching from the outside, it wears you down. But it also builds something steel inside you, something unshakable. Because when you know no one's coming to save you, you stop waiting, and you start building the tools to save yourself. It happened on a Wednesday, one of those dull gray mornings where even the sun couldn't be bothered to show up. I had been invited, more like expected, to attend the Mid-State Logistics Expo as part of the Morgan team, not as a speaker. Not even as a participant, just someone to assist with setup at the booth Derek would be speaking from. I wasn't going to go, but something in me said, go anyway. Not for them, for me. For the possibility that somewhere in that sea of manufactured smiles and stiff suits, I might find something. I wore black slacks, a clean white blouse, and no name tag. I didn't want anyone calling me Roy's niece. I just wanted to observe, learn, and breathe. While Roy and Derek flitted around shaking hands and tossing out buzzwords like synergy and AI-first strategy, I wandered to the quieter booths, the ones showcasing fleet software, last-mile delivery tech, and real-time routing dashboards. I started asking questions, the good kind, the kind that makes sales reps pause and ask, "Wait, what company did you say you were with?" I didn't answer, I just smiled. Near the back of the expo hall was a modest booth with no flashing screens or overproduced slideshows, just a single pull-up banner with the name Westfield Transport Solutions. A handful of people stood nearby chatting casually, no lines, no cameras. But I recognized the logo. Years ago, my father had spoken highly of Franklin Westfield, a man who built his company from a 2-truck operation into one of the most respected logistics firms in the country. He'd never taken Morgan Logistics seriously, calling it more ego than engine. I hovered at the edge of their table, listening. One of the reps was showing a model they'd developed, something about adaptive load balancing based on real-time fuel data. It was solid, but I saw a flaw in the way they weighted route priority over driver efficiency. I waited. Then I gently said, "You're losing margin in your third quadrant when weather delays intersect with driver rest hours." The rep blinked. "Sorry?" I walked over and pointed to their sample dashboard. If you loop driver fatigue scoring into your route logic, you can reduce third leg delivery overruns by at least 7%. Probably more if you introduce mid-shift load transfers. He stared, then he nodded slowly, eyes lighting up. "You work in ops?" "Something like that," I said, shrugging. That's when I heard the voice behind me. Calm, grounded. "Where'd you learn to spot that?" I turned. It was him, Franklin Westfield. Older than I remembered from photos. Silver hair, blue eyes that saw straight through people. "I built a model like that a few years ago," I said. "Never saw daylight." He studied me for a long beat, then extended his hand. "I'm Franklin. And you are?" "Kaia Morgan," I said carefully, unsure if the last name would shut the door. It didn't. In fact, his eyebrow lifted. "Morgan, huh? Related to Roy?" Niece, I said. He gave a short laugh. Didn't think he had anyone capable of real-time systems analysis. I smiled faintly. He doesn't know he does. He leaned against the table and folded his arms. You ever think about getting out from under his shadow? Every day. Good, he said. I have a project I'm working on. It's early stage, high discretion. Might be a good fit for someone like you. I blinked. What kind of project? He didn't answer directly, just handed me a card. One side had his name and number. The other said, some fires are meant to burn the right things down. He nodded once, then turned and walked away. I stood there holding that card for a long time. My mind was spinning, not with confusion, but with clarity. I didn't know exactly what he meant, but I knew it wasn't small, and I knew it wasn't just a courtesy. This wasn't a lifeline. It was a door. Quietly opened. No fanfare, no press. Just a quiet hand stretched towards someone who had been overlooked too long. The Monday after the expo, I didn't return to Morgan Logistics. I submitted my resignation with no explanation, no dramatics, and no goodbye party. Just a typed-out letter left on Roy's assistant's desk and my ID badge placed neatly beside it. They didn't even call. That told me everything. I moved out of my mother's house the same week. Not because she asked me to, she would have kept me there forever if she could, but because I needed my own air, my own space, my own silence. I rented a modest apartment downtown with a tiny second bedroom I turned into an office. No desk ornaments, no plaques, just whiteboards, a wall-mounted monitor, and 4 notebooks labeled System, Structure, Salaries, and Strategy. Franklin Westfield didn't waste time. He called me 3 days after the expo. I'm assembling a private task team, he said. We're acquiring a handful of legacy logistics businesses. Quietly, cleanly. I need someone who can look under the hood and tell me what's worth saving and what's dead weight. He didn't offer fluff or flattery, just trust. You'll have full access, full discretion, and I'll pay you what you're worth. That last part landed the hardest. For the first time, someone powerful wasn't asking me to prove I belonged. He was simply saying, I see you, let's work. And we did. For the next 6 months, I dove into acquisition models, business valuations, software audits, contract breakdowns, and route diagnostics. I wasn't just part of the strategy, I was writing it. The work was intense, long hours, no shortcuts. But I didn't feel drained like I used to. I felt sharpened. Everything I'd learned under Roy, the systems, the inefficiencies, the egos, became my map. The difference was, now I was using it to move pieces on the board, not just survive them. At night, I studied company filings and shareholder reports. During the day, I met with analysts, lawyers, and architects of scale. I wasn't just learning, I was building. Westfield gave me room to grow, but never let me get comfortable. He'd call me randomly and say things like, what's their revenue per mile adjusted for fuel inflation? Or, what's the burn rate if their B2B contract with Atlas drops by 15%? I always had the answer, and quietly, steadily, I earned not just his respect, but his full trust. One morning, during a walk through his operations center, he pulled me aside and said, I'm giving you lead on the next one. Which one? I asked. He smiled. Morgan Logistics. The words didn't hit me right away. I blinked. You're serious? He nodded. They're ripe. Too top-heavy. Too reliant on smoke and mirrors. You know where the bones are buried. And more importantly, you know which parts still have value. I want you to design the acquisition, end to end. I stared at him. Me. The girl who was told not to speak. The one who sat in the back, unseen. The one who clapped alone in a ballroom as her work was stolen. I nodded slowly. I'll need full data access, I said, in 6 weeks. You'll get it. That night, I walked into my apartment and stared at my reflection for a long time. I looked the same. Same face, same quiet eyes, same sharp chin. But I wasn't her anymore. I was no longer someone trying to fit in. I was someone about to take everything they thought they owned and do something better with it. Not because I wanted revenge, because I was done begging for a place. Now I owned my space, and I was coming for theirs. Roy didn't notice I was gone. Not really. A few weeks after I resigned, I heard from an old coworker that he told the team, Kaia needed a break. She'll be back when she figures out this corporate stuff isn't for her. He truly believed that. In his mind, I was just another soft-spoken girl who got overwhelmed and walked away. Not a threat, not a competitor, certainly not someone to keep an eye on. That's the thing about men like Roy. They confuse silence with surrender. While I was mapping his company's internal weaknesses, Roy was doing interviews with logistics magazines boasting about next-gen optimization. He even started calling Derek the new face of Morgan Logistics in press releases. The irony? He was using screenshots from my old models, edited just enough to make them look new, but not enough to hide their origin. I let him, because when someone is blind to the storm coming, you don't warn them. You let them enjoy the sunshine. Meanwhile, Derek had started doing weekly live streams from the corporate office. They were awful. He'd toss around buzzwords like rude intelligence and hyper-efficiency without understanding what any of it actually meant. In one video, he pointed at a chart and said, "This shows a 30% reduction in something," and then laughed it off. People in the industry started noticing. One logistics podcast host referred to him as the PowerPoint Prince. Another Twitter account joked, Morgan Logistics, where legacy meets mediocrity. But Roy didn't care. He was too busy planning a digital pivot launch event, complete with branded merchandise, a rented panel of thought leaders, and press coverage. I watched every move they made, quietly, carefully. What they didn't know was that by then, I already had access to their back-end systems. Through the acquisition process, Westfield's team, my team, was reviewing their financials, contracts, assets, and personnel rosters, and I was the one decoding every piece. Their inventory system? Outdated and leaking money. Their route efficiency claims? Inflated. Their customer retention data? Worse than they reported. To outside investors, Morgan Logistics looked solid. To me, it was a crumbling empire wrapped in glossy brochures. And yet, Roy strutted around like a king. At one point, he launched an internal newsletter titled Roy's Rules, filled with tone-deaf leadership tips and recycled motivational quotes. Rule number 4 read, "Always know who the smartest person in the room is and remind them it's you." I laughed when I read that, because Roy didn't even know who was in the room anymore. I bumped into him once, accidentally, in the lobby of a finance building we both happened to visit. He smiled, cordial but distant. "Kaia still consulting?" he asked. I nodded. Something like that. He looked proud of himself. Smart move getting out of the family business, it's tough in there. He had no idea. That evening, he posted a selfie from the boardroom with the caption, "Steering the ship, full speed ahead." The comments were full of clapping emojis and corporate platitudes. What no one knew was that the ship had a leak, and I had the blueprint to the lifeboats. The email came through on a Tuesday morning. Subject line, Morgan Logistics, acquisition review, final evaluation meeting. Location, Westfield Global Headquarters, 17th floor conference hall. Attendees, executive board, lead strategists, acquired entity leadership. Roy received the same email. So did Derek. So did every top-level executive in the Morgan chain of command. But none of them seemed to understand what it really meant. They assumed they were being invited to discuss a partnership or explore integration. Roy told his team that Westfield was simply doing due diligence before offering a large investment. He even printed a new run of business cards that read, Roy Morgan, Executive Chairman, Morgan Logistics, powered by Westfield. He told his assistant to reserve dinner at an expensive restaurant that evening for a post-meeting celebration. To him, this wasn't a test. It was a formality. What he didn't realize was that the deal had already been finalized, behind closed doors, quietly, legally, strategically. The only thing left was to present it, and I would be the one to present it. Franklin Westfield called me into his office the day before the meeting. He was sipping black coffee from a mug that said, "No ego, just execution." "I want you to lead the delivery," he said. "The whole thing." I blinked. "You sure?" He looked up, steady. "Kaia, no one knows that company like you do. No one worked harder to put this together. They disrespected you, ignored you, lied to you. And still, you didn't let that stop you. You made this happen." He paused, then added, "And I think it's time they realized it." I nodded slowly. But the truth was, I wasn't nervous about the presentation. I wasn't worried about the financial slides, the transition plan, or the projected growth forecast. I had practiced all of it down to the breath. What I couldn't predict was how I'd feel, standing in front of the same men who had spent years telling me to stay quiet. I spent the night before rehearsing, not just the content, but my presence. How I'd stand, how I'd walk in, how I'd look them in the eyes without a trace of bitterness. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about authority, mine. The morning of the meeting, I arrived early. I stood outside the building for a full minute before stepping in, watching the Westfield name glint in steel above the revolving doors. Inside, the lobby was already buzzing. People with badges, suits, tablets. My badge was different from theirs. It said, Kaia Morgan Lead, Acquisition and Transition Strategy Westfield Global. I took the elevator up alone. I needed that silence. As the doors opened on the 17th floor, I stepped into a hallway filled with glass, polished concrete, and sunlight. The conference room was waiting. So were the files, the chairs, the folders, the board. A few minutes later, Roy entered. Loud, confident, flanked by Derek and two senior VPs. He was mid-sentence about cross-market scalability when he caught sight of me. He froze for half a second, just half, then smiled. "Kaia," he said, surprised, "you consulting on this deal too?" I smiled politely. "Something like that." Derek gave me a nod, not really looking. He was too busy straightening his cufflinks. They took their seats, unaware that the entire meeting, every section, every document, every timeline, had been written by the same woman they once told to stay quiet. I opened my binder, flipped to the first page, and waited. At exactly 9 a.m., the door opened again and in walked Franklin Westfield. He didn't speak right away. He just looked around the room, then turned to me. "Kaia," he said, "you may begin." Every head turned, and in that moment the tone shifted. The game had already changed. They just hadn't caught up yet. I stood up slowly, calm and deliberate. I didn't rush. I didn't clear my throat or adjust the mic. I just looked out across the long, glossy conference table. 10 chairs on each side, every one of them filled with people who once looked through me. Roy was seated 3 spots down, flipping through the glossy agenda packet. Derek leaned back with his arms crossed like he was watching a school presentation. A few of their executives looked mildly interested, probably wondering how long this would take before coffee. I clicked to the first slide. Morgan Logistics Transition Overview, prepared by Kaia Morgan, Acquisition Lead. There was a beat of silence, short, sharp. Roy squinted at the screen, then looked down at his packet. Derek sat up straighter, then Franklin spoke. "For those who may not be aware," he said, his tone smooth but firm, "Kaia has led this acquisition from day one. The research, the diagnostics, the structure, the growth path, all of it. This is her project." Roy looked stunned. "Wait, Kaia? You're the acquisition lead?" I turned to him without emotion. "Yes." He tried to laugh, but it came out uneven. "You're telling me you orchestrated this whole deal? You're the one we've been negotiating with under Westfield's name?" I didn't blink. "That's correct." For the first time, Roy had no words. Derek leaned forward. What do you mean, acquisition? I thought this was a strategic partnership. Franklin stepped in, folding his hands calmly. Morgan Logistics has been acquired in full. As of this morning, we control all executive decisions, operations, and asset management. Your previous board has been dissolved. The room went dead silent. You could hear the faint hum of the projector. Roy opened his mouth, but I cut him off. Calm, professional. If you'll turn to page 3, you'll see the terms of continued employment for senior leadership. It outlines role reassignment, salary caps, and non-compete clauses. You'll also see that all executive-level personnel will now report directly to me during the integration period. Roy's jaw tensed. You're saying I work for you now? I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply said, yes. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the packet again. Derek's face had gone pale. He flipped to the page, read it, then slammed the folder shut. This is a setup, he hissed. There's no way the board agreed to this. They didn't have to, Franklin replied. You leveraged too many bad loans against weak growth, and your customer retention tanked. You left the door wide open. I clicked to the next slide. Profit recovery timeline. Phase 1, redundancies, consolidation, internal audit reviews. I continued the presentation without missing a beat, walking them through projected recoveries, rebranding phases, and how our analytics platform would improve routing efficiency by 23% over the next 2 quarters. Every stat had a source. Every claim had a graph. By the time I finished, even Roy's executives had stopped looking at him. They were looking at me. When I closed the presentation, the silence hung again. Thick, final. Roy finally spoke, voice low. You've been planning this. Planning, I echoed. Number. I've been building this. He stared at me like he didn't recognize me, like the niece he once ordered to be silent had been replaced by someone else entirely. But I hadn't changed. I just stopped asking permission. I reached into my binder, pulled out a document, and slid it across the table to him. Sign to keep your job, I said simply. He looked at the paper, then at me. His hand trembled. He picked up the pen. Roy stared at the pen in his hand as though it were poisoned. His fingers clenched around it, knuckles whitening, the same hand he'd once used to pat Derek on the back in front of everyone while pretending I wasn't in the room. I watched him struggle, not with the ink or the contract, but with the realization that the world had moved without his permission. He looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something unfamiliar behind his eyes. Fear. Not the theatrical kind, not anger disguised as control, but genuine fear. The kind that comes when a man realizes he's not in the room to decide anything. He's there to be told how it ends. I built that company, he said almost to himself, from the ground up. You inherited it, I replied, calm and clear. My father built the foundation. You took the credit. His lips parted like he wanted to argue, but the fight had drained out of him. He flipped to the last page of the document where the final signature line waited in bold ink. Next to me, Franklin stood quietly, arms folded, face unreadable. Across the table, Derek was panicking. You can't do this, he said, turning toward Franklin. This isn't legal. You're just going to hand her the keys to everything? No, Franklin said coolly. She earned them. Derek shoved back his chair and stood up, red-faced. I've been prepping for months, working nonstop, meeting clients, pitching new systems. Systems I designed, I said, turning to face him. Do you even know how they work? He opened his mouth, then closed it. I thought not. His posture changed, like someone realizing they've been standing on a trap door the whole time. His bravado cracked. He sat back down, eyes wide, hands gripping the arms of the chair, like it would keep him from falling further. Roy signed. He didn't make a scene. He didn't throw papers or storm out. He just signed, hand shaking, eyes blank, and slid the document back across the table. That was it. After years of controlling every room he entered, Roy Morgan had been reduced to a name on a line, on a paper handed to him by the niece he told to keep quiet. I turned to the executives on either side of him, men who had once laughed at his jokes while ignoring mine. "You'll each receive transition memos by noon," I said. "Some of your roles will change. Some won't exist by the end of the month." They nodded stiffly, faces pale, the weight of the moment settling around them. I wasn't here to humiliate anyone. I was here to clean house. And when the dust cleared, there would be no more shadows to hide behind. No more favors passed to cousins. No more credit taken by people who didn't earn it. Roy stood slowly, straightened his jacket, and gave me a long, unreadable look. "You always were smart," he said. "But you never looked long enough to see it," I answered. He nodded once and left the room. Derek followed him, silent now, his phone forgotten in his pocket. When the door clicked shut behind them, the air shifted, lighter, clearer. Franklin walked over, picked up the signed contract, and gave me a satisfied glance. "They never saw you coming. They never looked," I said, "and they paid the price for it. Not in headlines, not with scandal, but in the quiet, irreversible loss of power they'd never get back." The conference room slowly emptied. No dramatic exits. No applause. Just the quiet scuffle of shoes on polished floors and the soft hum of Westfield's building as it carried on with business as usual. But for me, the silence was everything. I stayed behind, gathering my notes into the leather folio I'd brought with me, the same one I used to carry during my intern days at Morgan Logistics, back when I sat in the back row and took notes no one asked for, only to be ignored when I handed them over. Back then, I used to think power came with shouting, with commanding attention, with slamming your hand on the table and making people look. But now I understood something different, something quieter, deeper. True power didn't need noise, it needed presence. And today, I had owned the room with nothing more than facts, strategy, and the weight of everything they had once overlooked in me. There was no rage in me, no fire or fury. That had all burned away long ago, back when I stood in that ballroom and watched Derek announce my project with a smile. What I felt now was peace. Not the fragile kind you get after a fight, but the rooted, solid kind that only comes when you know who you are and don't need anyone to validate it. I stepped out of the boardroom and into the hallway, nodding to the receptionist who offered a quiet, "Congrats, Ms. Morgan." I smiled softly, not pausing. The elevator ride down was quiet. The city moved outside the glass in a blur of motion, but inside I was still, reflective. I thought about my father, how he'd once told me, "Don't worry about being seen, just keep showing up. They'll catch up." He was right. I had shown up. Day after day, year after year, even when it hurt, even when it felt like no one would ever notice. And now, here I was, standing at the end of a story I never expected to finish this way. The lobby was buzzing as always, full of voices and footsteps. No one looked at me with recognition, and that was perfect. I didn't want fanfare. I didn't need the world to cheer, because the girl who once sat quietly at the end of the table had become the woman who now decided who sat there at all. I passed a wall of digital screens showing business news. One headline caught my eye: "Westfield acquisition of Morgan Logistics finalized. New leadership expected to reshape legacy operations." There was no mention of me in the byline, and I didn't mind, because success, for me, wasn't about my name in bold. It was about standing tall in a room full of people who once dismissed me, and not needing to say a word to prove I belonged. I walked out the revolving doors into the crisp morning air, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was chasing something. I had already arrived. 3 days after the takeover, my phone rang. Unknown number. I nearly ignored it, but something in me said to answer. "Kaia?" the voice said. Hesitant, almost fragile. I recognized it immediately. Roy. There was a long pause, the kind that begs the other person to fill the silence. I didn't. He cleared his throat. I wanted to say congratulations. You ran that meeting like a general. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window of my new office. It wasn't extravagant, just clean, modern, quiet, a place I had earned. Thank you, I said. I was surprised, he went on. I didn't see it coming. Didn't expect all that from you. That's because you never looked, I replied, calm but firm. Another pause. I guess I didn't, he admitted. I always thought you were smart, just quiet. I didn't think you had this in you. You didn't think I had what in me? I asked, knowing exactly what he meant but wanting to hear him say it. Strength, strategy, the ability to lead. I waited, unsure if this was building toward an apology or just an awkward call to save his own ego. Your father would have been proud, he added quietly. That caught me off guard. It wasn't what I expected to hear. Thank you, I said again, this time softer. He sighed. I guess I just wanted to say, I know I didn't treat you fairly, especially after your dad passed. I pushed you out and I didn't even realize I was doing it. You did realize, I said. You just didn't care. He didn't argue. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said, voice low. But I hope maybe one day we can talk again, like family. There was a flicker of something genuine in his voice, regret maybe, or loss. He wasn't trying to reclaim power. He wasn't trying to manipulate me. He sounded like a man who had finally run out of justifications. I thought about what to say, about what he'd taken from me, about the years of silence, of watching my work repackaged under his name, about being told not to speak unless spoken to. And yet, I didn't hate him, because I had already won, and holding on to anger would only chain me to a past I no longer lived in. Maybe one day, I said. Okay, he replied. Goodbye, Kaia. Goodbye, Roy. He hung up. I stared at my phone for a moment, then placed it face down on the desk. I didn't feel closure. I didn't feel some grand emotional release. What I felt was distance. The healthy kind. The kind that says, I'm not waiting for you anymore. And that was enough. It was a Thursday morning when I walked into the new Morgan Logistics headquarters. The name was still on the front of the building, for now. But everything inside had changed. The branding was being overhauled, teams restructured, workflows rebuilt from the ground up. No more ego-fueled hierarchy, no more invisible workforces, no more handshakes behind closed doors. I wasn't just part of the transition team, I was leading it. My title now read Chief Integration Officer, Westfield Global, Morgan Division. But to the staff inside, I was something else, the new face of the company. People stood up when I entered, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but respect. Not because of my last name, because of what I had done. The girl who once fetched coffee for meetings now set the agenda. The woman who sat silently in the back corner now stood at the front of the table. I held a briefing with department heads in the newly renovated boardroom. I could tell some were unsure of me at first. Old habits die hard. But within 10 minutes, they weren't asking who I was. They were taking notes. Because I wasn't talking about power or politics. I was talking about people, systems, growth, accountability. I don't care if you've been here 10 years or 10 days, I said. If your ideas are smart, they deserve to be heard. If your performance is consistent, it deserves to be rewarded. And if you can't respect the people around you, no matter their title, you don't belong in this room. There was silence, then nods, and I knew they understood. After the meeting, I stepped out onto the executive balcony. The city stretched beneath me, noisy and chaotic, but I was calm, centered. This was not revenge. Revenge would have been knocking Roy out of his chair, taking over his desk, firing his allies one by one with dramatic flair. But that wasn't me. That had never been me. This was resolution. This was standing in the light after years of being told to stay in the shadows. This was knowing I didn't need to scream to be heard. I just needed to build something too strong to be ignored. Behind me, the new team was getting to work. People I had selected. People I believed in. Analysts, operators, strategists. Many of them women who reminded me of myself 5 years ago. Quiet, overlooked, brilliant. I would make sure no one erased them the way I had been erased. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Franklin. "They're saying you pulled off the cleanest takeover we've seen in a decade." I smiled, typing back, "We're just getting started." I slid the phone into my pocket and stood a little taller. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of one no one else had the vision or the patience to write. And this time, I wasn't asking for a seat at the table. I owned the whole damn table.